America did not begin in 1776. It did not begin with ink drying on parchment, with speeches about freedom, or with a flag lifted into the wind. That moment was not a birth, it was a chapter break. Long before the United States had a name, before borders were drawn and states were counted, this land was already alive, not empty, not waiting, alive with nations that governed themselves, cities that rose and fell, trade routes that stretched hundreds of miles, and laws that bound people together long before any constitution was written. For thousands of years, America was shaped by human hands. Forests were managed, rivers were traveled, fields were cultivated, and alliances were negotiated. Powerful societies flourished here, some as large and complex as cities in Europe at the same time. They built ceremonial mounds that touched the sky, formed confederacies that balanced power and prevented domination, and passed down knowledge through generations without ever writing a single word. Their history lived in memory, in land, and in tradition. But when the story of America is told, that world is often pushed into the shadows. Textbooks rush past it. Classrooms summarize it. The narrative jumps quickly to arrival, discovery, and founding as if nothing meaningful existed before ships appeared on the horizon. What you were taught was a beginning that felt clean and heroic. What you were not taught was the cost of simplifying the past, because discovery is easier to celebrate than displacement. Founding is easier to explain than erasure, and power is easier to justify when the land is portrayed as empty. The real story of America stretches back thousands of years, far beyond any date carved into stone or printed on a page. It is a story of resilience and loss, brilliance and conflict, creation and destruction. A story where America was not born, it was inherited, reshaped, and renamed. And once you step beyond 1776, once you look beneath the surface of what you were taught, you begin to see a different America, older, deeper, and far more complicated than the one you thought you knew. Before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, North America was not an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was a continent shaped by human hands over thousands of years. Rivers were mapped by memory, forests were carefully managed, and land was used with purpose. Vast networks of native nations governed territories larger than many modern countries, each with its own laws, leaders, and traditions. These were not scattered tribes surviving at the edge of history. They were organized societies that understood power, balance, and survival. Some built massive earthen cities with central plazas and ceremonial mounds that dominated the landscape. Others formed political confederacies that limited the power of any one leader, creating systems of shared authority that rivaled and, in some cases, influenced European ideas of governance. They farmed on a large scale, traded across enormous distances, and maintained diplomatic relationships that lasted generations. Their knowledge of astronomy guided planting seasons and ceremonies. Their engineering shaped waterways, homes, and defenses. Their diplomacy prevented wars as often as it fought them. Yet, when history is retold, this world is reduced to a brief introduction, a background detail before the real story begins. Pages are skipped, names are forgotten, entire nations are condensed into a footnote. The result is a version of history that feels simpler, cleaner, and easier to tell, but far less true. This is the history they never taught you, not because it didn't exist, but because it complicates the story of how America was born. It challenges the idea of discovery, questions ownership, and forces us to confront the fact that the United States did not rise on untouched land, but on a continent with a deep and powerful past already written into its soil. For thousands of years before the word America existed, this continent was home to ancient native civilizations whose histories stretch back further than most nations on Earth. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, people had already adapted to nearly every environment imaginable: deserts, forests, plains, mountains, and coastlines, building societies that were deeply rooted in the land around them. These civilizations were not temporary or primitive. Many endured for centuries, even millennia, refining systems of governance, culture, and survival through generations of knowledge. Across North America, different regions gave rise to distinct civilizations. In the Southwest, ancestral Pueblo peoples built multi-story stone dwellings and vast cliffside communities, carefully engineered to withstand heat, drought, and invasion. In the Mississippi River Valley, the Mississippian culture constructed enormous earthen cities, the largest of which, Cahokia, once housed tens of thousands of people, making it larger than many European cities of the same era. These were planned urban centers with roads, marketplaces, and ceremonial spaces, not accidental settlements. In the Northeast and Great Lakes regions, powerful native nations formed agricultural societies based on corn, beans, and squash known as the Three Sisters, a farming system so effective it sustained large populations for centuries. Political systems emerged that emphasized balance and shared authority. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, united multiple nations under a common council, resolving conflicts through diplomacy rather than constant warfare. This system was so effective that elements of it later influenced American political thinkers. Trade networks connected the continent long before modern borders existed. Copper from the Great Lakes traveled hundreds of miles. Shells from coastal regions appeared deep inland. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices moved along these routes, binding distant peoples together. These exchanges created economic systems as complex as any early global trade network. Spiritual life was equally sophisticated. Ancient native civilizations observed the stars, tracked seasons, and aligned ceremonial structures with solstices and celestial events. Religion, science, and daily life were not separate, they were intertwined. Knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, storytelling, and ritual, ensuring history lived not on paper, but in people. These civilizations faced challenges: climate change, conflict, disease, and migration, but they adapted again and again. Some societies transformed into new ones. Others faded, leaving behind earthworks, ruins, and stories embedded in the land. Their disappearance was not a failure, but part of a long human cycle of change. Understanding ancient Native American civilizations forces us to confront a powerful truth. America's story did not begin with exploration or colonization. It began thousands of years earlier, shaped by people who built, governed, believed, and dreamed on this land long before it was ever claimed by a flag. Long before European capitals dominated maps and history books, one of the most powerful cities in North America rose quietly along the Mississippi River. Its name was Cahokia, and at its height around the year 1100 it rivaled the great cities of medieval Europe in size, influence, and complexity. While London and Paris were still developing, Cahokia was already a thriving urban center, carefully planned and deeply connected to the land around it. Located near present-day Illinois, Cahokia was not a village or a temporary settlement. It was a true city. At its peak, historians estimate that 20,000 to 40,000 people lived there, a population larger than most European cities of the same era. The city stretched across miles of land and was surrounded by smaller towns and farming communities that supported it. This was the heart of the Mississippian civilization, a society built on agriculture, trade, and spiritual authority. At the center of Cahokia stood Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in North America. It rose in massive tiers, carefully engineered with millions of baskets of packed soil, carried and shaped entirely by human hands. In volume, it was larger than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. From its summit, leaders could look out over the city below: plazas, homes, ceremonial grounds, and fields that fed thousands. This mound was not just architecture. It was a symbol of power, organization, and belief. Cahokia was designed with intention. Streets and open plazas were aligned with the sun and stars, marking solstices and seasonal changes. Wooden posts, sometimes called a woodhenge, tracked celestial movements with precision, guiding agricultural cycles and religious ceremonies. This level of astronomical knowledge required careful observation passed down over generations. Science, spirituality, and governance were inseparable. The city was also a major economic hub. Trade routes connected Cahokia to distant regions across North America. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and stone from far-off quarries flowed into the city. In return, Cahokia exported ideas, culture, and influence. Its reach extended far beyond its borders, shaping other communities throughout the Mississippi Valley. Social structure in Cahokia was complex. Leaders held both political and spiritual authority, while skilled craftsmen, farmers, traders, and laborers supported the city's growth. Farming, especially corn, allowed food surpluses that sustained large populations and freed people to specialize in building, artistry, and governance. This was not accidental success. It was the result of long-term planning and adaptation. Yet, despite its power, Cahokia did not last forever. By the 1300s, the city began to decline. The reasons are still debated: environmental strain, flooding, climate shifts, internal conflict, but its disappearance reminds us that even great cities are vulnerable. What remains today are the mounds, the soil, and the silence left behind. For centuries, Cahokia was ignored or misunderstood, its achievements dismissed or minimized. But its existence challenges a powerful myth that advanced cities only existed in Europe before modern times. Cahokia proves that America had capitals of its own long before colonization. Cities that governed, believed, traded, and thrived without stone castles, without written language, and without ever appearing in the history many of us were taught. Long before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, America was not as isolated as many people believe. While Columbus's voyage would later reshape world history, it was not the first time outsiders reached the shores of North America. Centuries earlier, and possibly even longer, other travelers arrived, interacted briefly with the land, and then vanished from the dominant historical narrative. The most well-documented early visitors were the Vikings, seafaring explorers from Scandinavia. Around the year 1000 AD, Norse sailors led by Leif Erikson journeyed west from Greenland and reached what they called Vinland. Archaeological evidence confirms their presence at Lonceau Meadows in present-day Newfoundland, Canada. This was not legend or myth, it was a real settlement, complete with buildings, tools, and signs of metalworking. The Vikings had crossed the Atlantic nearly 500 years before Columbus, yet the Viking presence was brief. Harsh climates, limited supplies, and conflicts with local indigenous peoples made permanent settlement difficult. After a short time, the Norse abandoned Vinland and returned east. Their voyage did not lead to colonization, conquest, or lasting control. Because it did not permanently alter power structures, it faded from popular history, proof that history often remembers impact more than arrival. Beyond the Vikings, there are ongoing debates about other possible early contacts. Some scholars suggest that Polynesian navigators, famous for crossing vast stretches of the Pacific using stars, currents, and wind patterns, may have reached parts of the Americas. Evidence, such as the spread of certain crops and shared technologies, continues to be studied, though definitive proof remains limited. What is clear is that ancient peoples were far more capable travelers than once believed. There is also evidence of transcontinental contact within the Americas themselves. Long before Europeans arrived, Native American trade networks stretched across thousands of miles. Obsidian, copper, shells, and ceremonial goods moved between distant regions. While these were not visitors from overseas, they showed that America was already part of a connected world, one defined by movement, exchange, and communication. What separates these early visitors from later European explorers is intent. The Vikings came, explored, and left. They did not claim ownership, redraw borders, or attempt to replace existing societies. Their arrival did not erase native civilizations or rename the land. In contrast, later European voyages were driven by empire, wealth, and control. The difference between visiting and colonizing would define the future of the continent. The reason Columbus is remembered is not because he was first, but because his arrival triggered permanent and devastating change. His voyage connected the Americas to Europe in a way that could not be undone. It began an era of conquest, disease, displacement, and transformation that reshaped the world. Understanding the visitors who came before Columbus challenges a powerful myth that America was suddenly discovered in 1492. In reality, America had already been reached, explored, and known. What made Columbus different was not discovery, but consequence. By acknowledging these early visitors, we begin to see history more clearly. America was never hidden. It was never lost. It was always here, known to its people, touched by outsiders, and waiting not to be discovered, but to be understood. When Europe arrived in the Americas, the encounter was not a single moment of discovery, it was a collision of worlds that unfolded over centuries. European explorers did not step onto untouched land. They entered a continent already shaped by nations with their own histories, rivalries, alliances, and systems of life. What followed was not a peaceful meeting of cultures, but a slow, uneven process of contact, disruption, and transformation that forever altered both sides. At first, contact was limited. Small groups of Europeans arrived along the coasts, relying heavily on native communities for survival. They needed food, guidance, trade, and knowledge of unfamiliar environments. Early relationships were often based on exchange. Native nations traded food and furs for metal tools, weapons, and goods they had never seen before. In these early years, Europeans were not in control. They were vulnerable guests in powerful indigenous worlds. But even in these first encounters, invisible forces were already at work. European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza began spreading among native populations. With no prior exposure, indigenous communities had no immunity. Entire villages were devastated, sometimes before they ever saw a European face. This biological catastrophe reshaped the continent more rapidly and brutally than any battle. Societies weakened, leadership structures collapsed, and long-standing balances of power were destroyed. As European presence increased, motives shifted. What began as exploration became competition. Spain, France, and England sought land, resources, and influence. They brought with them the concept of ownership defined by monarchs and empires, ideas that clashed with native understandings of land as communal, spiritual, and shared. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten, and ignored. Alliances were formed and dissolved as European powers used native nations against one another in imperial struggles that were not their own. Missionaries followed soldiers and traders. They sought to convert native peoples, often dismantling traditional beliefs, languages, and customs in the process. Conversion was rarely neutral. It was tied to control. Children were separated from families. Sacred practices were banned or replaced. Over time, culture itself became a battleground. Violence escalated as settlements expanded inland. Forests were cleared, rivers redirected, and hunting grounds fenced. When native nations resisted, they were labeled obstacles to progress. Wars erupted, some large, some small, many forgotten, each pushing indigenous peoples further from their homelands. Removal was often justified as inevitable, even necessary, rather than as a choice made by those in power. Yet it is important to understand that native peoples were not passive victims of history. They adapted, negotiated, resisted, and survived. Some nations used diplomacy to protect their people. Others fought to defend their land. Many blended old traditions with new realities, finding ways to endure in a rapidly changing world. Survival itself became an act of resistance. What really happened when Europe arrived was not a simple story of discovery and settlement. It was a complex process of exchange and exploitation, cooperation and betrayal, survival and loss. It was the beginning of a new world built on an old one, often without acknowledging what already existed beneath it. This moment reshaped America's future. Borders, states, and nations would rise from the consequences of these encounters. And to understand the United States as it exists today, we must first understand this truth. Europe did not create America from nothing. It entered a living continent, changed it forever. When Europeans established a foothold in North America, control of the land did not happen all at once. It unfolded through a quiet, deliberate process, one that relied as much on paperwork and language as it did on force. Land was not simply conquered. It was taken, renamed, and rewritten until its original meaning disappeared beneath new maps and new laws. For native nations, land was not a commodity. It was communal, spiritual, and relational. Boundaries were understood through shared use, seasonal movement, and ancestral ties rather than fences or deeds. European powers brought a radically different idea: land as property that could be owned, sold, inherited, and controlled by distant rulers. This clash of worldviews created a legal illusion. Europeans claimed land was unused or unwound, simply because it was not divided or farmed in European ways. Treaties became one of the primary tools of land seizure. On paper, they appeared lawful and mutual. In reality, many were signed under pressure, mistranslated, misunderstood, or outright ignored. Some native leaders believed they were agreeing to shared land use or temporary access, while European governments interpreted the same words as permanent surrender. When treaties stood in the way of expansion, they were revised, broken, or replaced with new ones that benefited settlers. As settlements grew, maps began to change. Indigenous place names that described geography, history, or spiritual meaning, were replaced with European ones honoring kings, queens, generals, and investors who had never set foot on the land. Rivers, mountains, and entire regions were renamed, erasing native presence not only from the land itself, but from memory. Once a place was renamed, it was easier to claim it had always belonged to someone else. Law followed renaming. European-style courts declared native nations dependent, domestic, or incapable of full sovereignty. Land that had been governed for centuries was suddenly declared subject to foreign authority. As colonies became states, these legal frameworks hardened. What had once been native homelands were redrawn into counties, territories, and state borders that ignored existing nations entirely. When legal tools failed, removal followed. Native peoples were pushed westward through forced migrations, often justified as necessary for progress or security. Entire communities were uprooted and marched away from ancestral lands to unfamiliar territories. These removals were not accidents of history, they were policies, debated and approved, carried out in full view of the public. Once the land was cleared, it was rewritten again. New histories were taught. Textbooks described settlement as brave expansion, ignoring who had lived there before. Native resistance was reframed as hostility. Survival was reframed as disappearance. Over time, the rewritten story became the accepted one, yet the land remembers what maps try to erase. Beneath farms, cities, and highways lie former villages, trails, burial grounds, and sacred sites. Many modern state borders follow older native trade routes or territorial divisions, even if their origins are no longer acknowledged. The past was not destroyed, but was buried under new names and narratives. How land was taken, renamed, and rewritten is central to understanding America. The United States was not built on blank space. It was built on land with a deep history, reshaped by power and preserved through memory. To tell the story honestly is not to undo the present, but to recognize the truth beneath it and the voices that were written out, but never fully erased. As the United States expanded, state borders began to appear on maps as clean lines, straight, orderly, and permanent. They gave the impression of structure and unity, as if the land had always been divided this way. But these borders did not emerge naturally, and they did not reflect the realities that existed before them. Instead, they erased older nations, replacing living indigenous territories with political boundaries designed for control, governance, and expansion. Before states existed, native nations already had borders of their own. These boundaries were shaped by rivers, mountains, hunting grounds, alliances, and centuries of negotiation. They were flexible but deeply understood, enforced through tradition, diplomacy, and sometimes conflict. European settlers and later American lawmakers dismissed these systems because they did not resemble European maps. What could not be measured in straight lines was treated as if it did not exist. As colonies turned into states, land was reorganized to serve the needs of a growing nation. Borders were drawn in distant capitals by people who had never seen the land or met its original inhabitants. Surveyors carved territory into squares, ignoring sacred sites, seasonal migration routes, and existing native boundaries. A single native nation could find its land suddenly divided across multiple states, weakening its political power and legal standing. State borders also became tools of control. Once land was classified as a state or territory, it fell under U.S. law rather than native governance. This shift allowed federal and state governments to regulate, tax, and redistribute land without indigenous consent. Native nations that once dealt with European empires as equals were reduced to wards of the state, their sovereignty redefined and restricted. The creation of new states often followed removal. Indigenous peoples were pushed off valuable land, and once it was cleared, it was reorganized into territories and eventually states. This process made dispossession appear orderly and legitimate. By the time a state was admitted to the Union, the original inhabitants had already been forced aside, making their absence seem natural rather than engineered. Education and maps reinforced this erasure. Children learned state names, capitals, and borders, but rarely the names of the native nations who lived there before. History lessons treated statehood as the beginning of civilization in each region. What came before was framed as prehistory important, perhaps, but disconnected from the modern state. Yet the erasure was never complete. Many state borders overlap older indigenous divisions. Rivers that form state lines once marked trade routes or territorial boundaries. Place names, though altered, still carry echoes of native languages, and many native nations continue to exist today, navigating a system that divided their lands without consent. Understanding why state borders erased older nations reveals an uncomfortable truth. Statehood was not just about unity or governance, it was also about replacing one system of belonging with another. Borders did not simply organize land, they rewrote identity, authority, and history. The United States presents itself as a nation built on states, but beneath those borders lie nations far older. Recognizing this does not weaken America's story, it deepens it. It reminds us that modern maps are the final layer of a much longer history, one that cannot be fully understood without acknowledging what was drawn over, divided, and nearly forgotten. Modern America often presents itself as a nation born in the late 18th century, shaped by revolutions, constitutions, and statehood. But beneath highways, cities, and state borders lies a far older foundation, one built by the people who lived on this land long before the United States existed. These forgotten foundations still shape America today, even when their origins are rarely acknowledged. Many of America's systems did not emerge from nothing. Agricultural practices developed by native civilizations made large-scale settlement possible. Crops such as corn, potatoes, squash, and beans were not European discoveries. They were native innovations refined over generations. These foods became essential to American survival and growth, sustaining populations as states expanded westward. Without indigenous agricultural knowledge, early colonies and later states may not have survived long enough to flourish. Political influence runs just as deep. Systems of shared governance, councils, and confederacies existed in North America centuries before the U.S. Constitution was written. The idea that power should be balanced, that leaders should be accountable, and that unity could exist without absolute rulers was not foreign to this land. While the United States developed its own institutions, it did so in a world where these ideas were already present, practiced, and proven. America's geography also tells this hidden story. Major cities sit on or near ancient native settlements because those locations were chosen wisely near water, trade routes, and fertile land. Rivers that defined state borders once connected indigenous nations through commerce and diplomacy. Roads and railways often follow older native trails, quietly preserving paths first walked centuries ago. Even cultural identity is shaped by what came before. Words, place names, and symbols derived from native languages are woven into everyday American life. Sports teams, states, rivers, and cities carry names whose meanings are often forgotten, but whose presence remains constant. These names are echoes of nations that never truly disappeared, even when history tried to silence them. Yet the foundations are not only physical or cultural, they are moral. The contradictions in America's founding ideals, the tension between liberty and exclusion, did not appear suddenly. They grew from a past where freedom was proclaimed, while entire nations were displaced. Understanding this history helps explain why debates over land, rights, and identity continue today. The past is not gone. It is unresolved. Native nations still exist, still govern, and still protect their cultures within a system that was built over them. Their resilience is a reminder that America's story is not finished. It is layered. Each generation adds a new chapter, but none erase what came before. Modern America rests on these forgotten foundations, whether it acknowledges them or not. To recognize this is not to deny the nation's achievements, but to see them more clearly. America is not just a young country, it is an old land with a long memory. And understanding the truth changes how we understand everything built upon it. By the time the first U.S. states were formed, America was not standing on new ground. It was standing on layers of lives lived, battles fought, cities built, and worlds lost. Beneath the soil where state capitals would rise, beneath the roads that would later connect a nation, there already existed a deep, bloody, brilliant history that had shaped the land long before a single star was added to a flag. Every state that entered the Union did so on land with a past measured not in decades, but in centuries and millennia. Fields where treaties were signed had once been hunting grounds. Towns founded by settlers sat atop older villages whose names were erased but whose footprints remained. Rivers that now divide states once connected nations, carrying trade, stories, and alliances across the continent. None of this disappeared when borders were drawn. It was simply buried beneath new names and new narratives. The violence that marked America's formation did not begin with revolution. It began earlier, in the quiet spread of disease, in the breaking of agreements, in the slow tightening of boundaries that left native nations with fewer places to stand. This history is bloody, not because it was chaotic, but because it was deliberate. Decisions were made, policies were written, lines were drawn, and each choice reshaped the future of the land and the people tied to it. But this history is also brilliant. Brilliant in its resilience. Brilliant in the civilizations that flourished without steel, without written language, without empires. brilliant in the knowledge passed down through memory instead of books, in the systems of governance that valued balance over domination, and in the ability of people to adapt again and again in the face of loss. Even survival itself became a form of resistance. When the United States tells its story, it often begins at statehood, as if order replaced chaos, as if history truly started once the map looked familiar. But that comfort comes at a cost. It teaches us to see what came before as irrelevant, instead of foundational. It teaches us to see progress without asking who paid for it. And it teaches us to look forward without fully understanding what we stand on. Once you see the deeper story, it becomes impossible to unsee it. State borders no longer look neutral. Place names begin to sound like echoes. Monuments feel incomplete. You start to recognize that America is not just a nation that grew, it is a nation that was built on top of something much older, something that still shapes it in ways both visible and hidden. This does not mean rejecting American history. It means understanding it honestly. It means realizing that pride and truth are not enemies, that a nation strong enough to look at its past fully is stronger, not weaker, for doing so, and that forgetting history does not erase it, only ensures it will be misunderstood. The soil remembers what textbooks forget. The land holds stories that maps cannot show. And the people who came before were not a prologue to be skipped, but the foundation on which everything else was built. Once you truly see that, once you understand that America did not rise from nothing, but from a long, contested, human past, you will never look at American history the same way again.